Gabriele Rosana, thank you again for joining me in another conversation on subject that do not matter only for the both of us, but also for our colleagues and for the culture and creative sector at large. If you would be so kind to guide us through, as we spoke before, through the Cultural Deal for Europe. You, as a Policy Director for Cultural Action Europe, and joined by your colleagues from European Cultural Foundation and Europa Nostra, have encompassed this long-term project through campaigns and advocacy means and so on and so forth, about this idea of a cultural deal for Europe. I will leave this question very open, and if you can tell us briefly what is it about, and maybe we will just take one or two points of it and open them as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oana. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks again for having the opportunity to have this talk. The Cultural Deal for Europe, well, it dates back in a way to 2019. 2019 was even before the pandemic outbreak, so it's another word in a way. But already then, this coalition that you just named, Cultural Action Europe, the major European cross-sectorial cultural network, joined the European Cultural Foundation, so the leading organization for cultural philanthropy in Europe, and Europa Nostra, the voice of civil society committed to cultural heritage. They joined forces to raise voice, because back then, in the draft outline of the European Commission, there was not a commissioner for culture. So the campaign back then was not yet the Cultural Deal for Europe, but it was an ancestor in a way. The campaign was Bring Back Culture, Madam President. So it was a campaign, a successful, in the end, campaign aimed at Ursula von der Leyen. Then the pandemic came, and then we sat down digitally on Zoom, like everyone else, and started asking ourselves, what is the answer? What is the contribution for culture to this major paradigm change that is happening in Europe and across the world? And we make a comparison. Like the Green Deal was unrolling at the time, right? It's probably the main policy initiative of the European Union at the moment. The ambition is that to become the first climate neutral continent in the world as of 2050. And then we sat down and we said, like the greening of our societies, like the Green Deal, like the environmental goal has become such a key policy priority for Europe, culture should have a similar treatment, or actually a similar recognition, like a policy area that actually crosses all other policy areas. And then that's how in November 2020, 3 years ago, the Cultural Deal for Europe first was launched online with the endorsement of the late president of the European Parliament, David Sassoli, the Commissioner for Culture at the time, Maria Gabriele, and so on. So that's how it all was set in motion. And within the Cultural Deal for Europe, what we started bullet pointing were the key contributions, not only that Europe can give to culture, but also that culture can give to Europe. In a way, the main rallying cry for us was culture is not just a sector of the economy, it's a vector for sustainable development for our societies. And that's also the link with the Cultural Deal, with the Green Deal, and the link with another ongoing campaign that's more on a global scale, the campaign of the cultural goal for the world. So to include culture as a self-standing goal within the Sustainable Development Agenda. We know that up until this moment we have 17 goals. Culture is not explicitly mentioned anywhere. It's interesting because on the other hand, we can see culture present everywhere through a critical analysis, but there is not an explicit goal recognizing culture. And Cultural Action Europe, as the major European cultural network, is part of a campaign, a global campaign, asking for a self-standing cultural goal in the revision of the UN Sustainable Development Agenda. So that's how it all came about, and if we want to, I just will name drop. Apologies, but that's indeed for the sake of the time, I will just name drop a few topics that we have in the cultural deal. We span from improving the working conditions of artists and cultural workers to indeed the role of culture in terms of advancing the climate objectives. So not only greening the cultural sector, it's an important sector of the economy, but it's a small sector of the economy. The contribution that culture can make is indeed a societal contribution when it comes to the climate goal. To culture and democracy, we are shifting in the European debate, and luckily so, from participation, from access to culture, likely to participation to cultural participation in culture, co-creation, and that's a paradigm shift that is very much present also in the cultural deal. To funding for culture, of course, increasing public funding for culture, at the same time recognizing the complementary role that the private actors like philanthropic organizations can play, and that's the topic of public-private partnerships that is mentioned in the cultural deal, and recovery of our societies within the cultural deal. And I will stop there. Oana, we had a all in all successful sub-campaign of the cultural deal. The EU countries were asked between 2020 and 2021 to draft the recovery plans, to then use the recovery money given by the European Union, and we started the first ever mapping exercise to see how that money, if ever, was going to culture to finance what activities in culture it was going. The spoiler, if you don't have the time to see our study, is that it went mostly to infrastructure and not to the people employed in culture, to the people working in culture, and not to the independent and small scene. In the end, the very gist of the cultural deal for Europe is indeed bringing back culture to the heart of the public policy and the political debate. We talk a lot in Brussels. I mean, I'm connected from Brussels. We're talking here a lot in Brussels about cultural policy, but the very need, and it's good to say that as we are preparing for the European elections, the very need is adding cultural politics besides cultural policy. So recognizing the political role of culture and cultural actors.
Thank you so much. You pinpoint very specific issues. Very many points that you mentioned are maybe at first sight can be seen as very different, very different areas of development and advocacy. Did you feel that putting all these focus points, all these issues about culture within a single umbrella, the cultural deal for Europe, would be easier for the policymakers at local and European level to grasp the whole field of issues? How did you decide to put this umbrella?
The idea of having an umbrella is a political decision of bundling everything together, saying culture needs first visibility and recognition. That's what we are talking about. And second, needs a unified approach. And then, of course, all those calls that I name dropped there have specificities, have different level of competences for the European institutions. But what is needed there, since the Cultural Deal for Europe is a campaign, is a unified call for action, saying that we need culture for Europe, but we need Europe for culture as well. We need European policies for culture. What is at stake is also cultural diversity. That's one of the few times when culture is named in the European treaties, the European founding treaties, is because of cultural diversity. If we do not have unified approach at European level to preserve cultural diversities in the member states. We cannot simply leave that to the member states. That's also the reasoning behind our study on the recovery plans. We cannot simply read the reports from the member states. We need a common European understanding of culture, also because culture is the backbone of the European project. One could also highlight, and of any political integration process, perhaps we can add. So the idea of having an umbrella, yes, it's a campaign, and the campaign going to the institutions, but then it's made out of several different calls. Some of them are more mature than others. Working conditions in the cultural and creative sectors was not mature when we first launched the cultural deal. There was no willingness to pick it up, to develop it from the side of the European institutions. But then something came, and that something is the COVID pandemic, which showed how much precarious the working conditions in the cultural sectors are, which showed the different safety net level of protections diverging from member states, which have very good statuses of the artist, others who do not have anything at all, some which just have some rules for performing arts, but not for visual artists. So that total divergence in diversity came out, and that was a good point to advocate for a European framework. We are not saying that Brussels needs to dictate anything to the member states. Then culture is something that is so specific that needs to be regulated at the closest level to the citizens possible, ideally with the citizens themselves. But creating that safety net was indeed part of this whole effort on the working conditions. And I'm very happy to say that on these very days, on the third week of November, the European Parliament will rubber stamp and validate the first ever legislative report on the working conditions for artists and cultural workers. That was nothing at all possible to have in 2019. This whole legislative term in the European Parliament made it possible. With the push of the cultural and creative sectors, it advanced the dossier, and we are now in a situation where there is not a European status of the artist yet. There will not be one in the coming months, but the ground is fertile to have such a thing high on the list of priorities of the next commission, the one which will be sworn in late 2024. Of course, EU institutions have their pace, they have their time, which is different than that of national governments, and from time to time that can be frustrating. On the other hand, politically speaking, that has been a huge quantum leap, because for the first time we have an European institutions, the European Parliament, saying we need European legislation, not soft law, not guidelines, not recommendation, European legislation on the status of the artist to identify what is the the bare minimum that a status of the artist at national level should have.
Yes, I was very surprised in a very pleasant way when I saw this. And yes, unfortunately, but fortunately, COVID was a momentum, and there are some issues like this one that must be dealt at European level, because otherwise, yeah, it's a very unequal approach at the state level, and it seems almost impossible to deal with each and every local or national policy. Furthermore, that artists are on the move. I mean, you cannot apropos also copyright, but we will not. Maybe we will open this for another discussion. So actually, to be a nation concentrated, it is already obsolete. But coming back to sustainable development goals, Yeah, I have noticed also in a unique global, for example, strategy that they try to just take sustainable development goals number by number and put it and say this would be this, and like deconstructing almost all goals in kind of pieces that are specific to the cultural and creative field. Would this be so far, because culture does not appear there, so far a working solution for trying to insert some, if not all, some of these sustainable development goals into cultural projects and creative projects? How would you see that? And of course, not only at policy level, but if there is any possibility at grassroots level. So if an organization wants to, I don't know, to take 1 or 2 or 5 sustainable development goals and to put it in their projects, what would be a fair approach?
Let me start with what you were mentioning now. I mean, the grassroots approach. The cultural deal for Europe, where also the 18th goal is featured, is a grassroots campaign in a way. It is aimed at political level, but it is constructed in a way, and actually we created a cookbook out of it, together with my colleagues here at Cultural Action Europe, together with members of Cultural Action Europe. We deconstructed the calls of the cultural deal, including the sustainable development one, to create recipes out of them, to make, I mean, they're more, to use a creative language, to deconstruct it. So in that sense, we created some tools for the cultural agents to play with. That's important, that it's not only a serious exercise, but we also play with it, and to use as a campaign tools and to make them thrive in their local conversations. We are doing our part in Brussels, but we cannot, I mean, there are best positioned actors to continue that conversation at grassroots level. First, in terms of grassroots, you can endorse the cultural deal for Europe. So we create that critical mass that we need to advocate with the decision makers. But second, you use it in your local activities. I mean, it's free to use. It's an open source content that indeed can be used by everyone in their campaigning guidelines. Speaking about the cultural deal for Europe, but the same goes with the global goal, with the cultural goal for the planet. So with the campaign on the 18th goal. Also, as at Cultural Action, we at Cultural Action Europe in 2019 did a sort of deconstruction, taking all the 17 and identifying the place for culture in each and every one of them. Which is important. It's about mainstreaming culture everywhere, because culture is everywhere. It's not just a tiny sector of the economy. That's the paradigm shift that we need here in conversations in Brussels. It's not just a sector that employs 12 million people in Europe, that generates more than 4% of GDP. It has a value that it's not measurable. And it simply escapes from the tables of the impact assessments of the public authorities, or at least it does if we look at the short termism that public authorities normally do have. And so we need to look at the bigger picture for culture and contaminate our work indeed on the local level with that. Also appropriating from what open source indeed content from the global and the European networks exists already, and use it, as you rightly said, Oana, for our projects, in our activities, either brainstorming on what a cultural goal for the planet can be, the way it should be phrased. There is a more than zero now draft that had been presented in Mondia Cult in Mexico City in September 2022, which is the basis for the conversation of the coalition we are part in, the Culture 2030 Goal campaign. And so there is the 18th goal draft, but there are 17 already existing goals, and perhaps indeed reviewing them as part of exercises that can happen at local level, and critically assessing them to see where culture is hidden there is also stimulating and fruitful. I mean, it's actually bearing fruit as an exercise.
Thank you very much. And one last question, maybe a more fluid one, so to speak. Apropos as well, grassroots. So actually, if an organization, or why not an artist, would like to address these very comprehensive issues and apply it to a very specific project or artistic project or a cultural project, where should they start? I mean, do they necessarily have to artists to be activists in order to approach one of these issues, or they just I don't know, look at the resources of cultural action in Europe and they read it and they transform it in a cultural or artistic project? How an artist or a cultural organization can address all these? I mean, these are huge issues, and of course with a vast vision and on a long term. But if you want to transform it into an action, a project, a small project, what your advice would be?
I was smiling because now it's the time for the reclam, for the marketing. I'm joking, but my first answer, I mean, out of sincerity, would be, my first honest answer would be joining the conversation that is already happening. Be part of it. Make your voice heard, listen to the others, co-create together, and participate. That's the cultural participation paradigm I was referring before. And the Cultural Action in Europe community per se, I mean, we have a very diverse membership. We have the big cultural networks, but we have also individual artists, individual activists. We have public authorities, local authorities especially, policymakers themselves, organizations active on a national or regional level. And that's where the conversation is happening. So all the positions of Cultural Action in Europe I've been telling you up until now are indeed produced in this collective setting. It's not something that is just cooked in Brussels, but comes from the diversity and the multiplicity of our membership. So my first advice is indeed be part of that conversation, however you want to be part of it, either by following or interacting every now and then, or being structurally part of an organization, becoming member in a way. That's the reclam part I was referring before. But in any case, as we are approaching the 2024 European elections, 9th of June, we have a project on that specifically, and we are mobilizing young artists everywhere in Europe to have a creative eye on the European elections. And that is just an example. But looking at the European elections 2024, cultural agents, individual artists, whether they are already activists or not, have the inestimable opportunity to use that appointment as to feature their creative language in that appointment. So indeed, to shift the conversation from some cultural policy, which at the end of the day sounds like some boring stuff for technical experts of the topic, make it cultural politics, and reviving that political bone that cultural campaigning and that culture per se has. So I would say, in a nutshell, it's again that word, it's participating with your own creative language, with your own project, interacting with our projects, co-creating, opening up to new opportunities, not forgetting that indeed every cultural language, every artistic language is at the end of the day a political language, and make sure that that message goes through also to the policymakers, to the political side.
Thank you so much, Gabriele Rosana. I have, of course, many questions, but I will address in a hopefully future interview on different other subjects. Thank you again, and fingers crossed, of course. And congratulations for all the work you are doing, you and your colleagues and the members of the network. And hope to discuss.
Until next time, Oana, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.